The rope is wet and it's cutting into your shoulder. You've been pulling since before sunrise and the sun still hasn't cleared the ridge. Ahead of you, 200 other people are leaning into the same rope, breathing in the same rhythm, all of them staring at the ground in front of their feet. Behind you sits a single block of limestone that weighs more than a bus. You can feel it through the rope. Not as a weight exactly, more like a mood. When the block wants to move, the rope goes soft and warm in your hands. When it doesn't, the rope hums, and that sound travels up through your arms and settles in your teeth. Nobody here has a machine. There's no engine anywhere on this planet. There won't be one for another 4,500 years. There is rope, wood, water, and human bodies. And your body is the part that breaks. That's the lesson you learn fast on a site like this. The stone never gets tired. The timber never gets tired. You do. If the man 3 places ahead of you loses his footing on the wet clay, the whole line snaps sideways. The block shifts a hand's width, and somebody's leg is underneath it. You've watched it happen. Everyone on this rope has. So the question sitting in your chest all morning has nothing to do with architecture. It's much simpler than that. How long can a person do this before their body gives out? And what happens to you on the day it does? Here's what you've probably been told about the people pulling that rope. Slaves, chains, whips, an overseer walking the line while thousands of broken men die in the dirt so a king can have a big tomb. That's the version in the movies, and it's the version most people still carry around in their heads without ever questioning it. Then archaeologists dug up where these workers actually lived and died, a short walk from the pyramids at Giza, and found the wrong thing entirely. They found bakeries, dozens of them. They found breweries with vats big enough to serve a small town. They found the bones of cattle and sheep in numbers suggesting thousands of animals were being brought in from the countryside and eaten on site. They found sleeping platforms, cooking pots, and cemeteries with careful burials laid out in view of the monuments themselves. And inside those graves were skeletons with broken bones that had been set, splinted, and left to heal straight. Nobody sets the leg of a man they're planning to work to death. So if these weren't prisoners, who were they? And if nobody was holding a weapon over them, why would anyone spend their one short life hauling rock across a desert? Start with what was actually in your stomach. The workers' settlement at Giza was, in practical terms, a food factory with a construction site attached to it. The bread ovens ran nonstop. The brewing vats were enormous. Beer wasn't a treat there. It was calories and safe liquid, and it got handed out by volume, the same way you'd hand out water on a job site now. The meat is the part that flips the story on its head. Meat was expensive in the ancient world. Most farmers tasted it a handful of times a year, on festival days, and not much even then. The bone heaps at Giza suggest the people building the pyramids were eating beef and mutton on a regular basis. Sit with that for a second. You could stay in your village, farm your patch of dirt, and eat barley mush until you died. Or you could go to the build, wreck your back for a few months, and eat like the wealthy. That isn't slavery. That's a dangerous job with an extremely good lunch. But it opens up something stranger. Feeding 20,000 people every single day in a desert with no trucks and no way to keep anything cold is arguably a harder problem than moving the stone. Somebody had to grow that grain, herd those cattle, count the rations, and land it all on site before it spoiled. So how do you feed a city that doesn't exist yet? The answer is the river, and the river is also the reason you're standing here at all. Every year the Nile flooded, not a disaster flood, a scheduled one. The water spread out across the farmland, dropped a fresh layer of black silt, and then pulled back again. For roughly 3 months, the fields were underwater, and there was nothing on earth a farmer could do about it. 3 months with no work. 3 months of the food store dropping. 3 months of watching your family eat into next season's grain while you sat there useless. Then word comes down from the king's people. Come and work. We'll feed you. We'll feed your household, and when the water drops, you go home to a field that's richer than it was last year. Suddenly, the whole thing makes a different kind of sense. These weren't captives dragged in from somewhere far away. They were farmers with an empty calendar and a shrinking store, showing up for the ancient world's version of seasonal work. You came in a crew from your own town. You knew the men on either side of you. Your brother was probably somewhere behind you on the same rope, which is exactly why the danger felt so personal. When the line lurched, it was never a stranger who went down. But understanding why you're here doesn't explain the impossible part. Motivation doesn't move limestone. Something had to make a 15-ton block slide across sand. And sand is close to the worst surface on Earth for dragging anything. So what were they doing out there that we couldn't work out for centuries? For a long time, this was genuinely embarrassing for modern engineers. Try it yourself sometime. Load a sled on dry sand and pull. The sand piles up in front of the runners, builds into a wall, and the sled stops dead. Add more people, and all you get is a bigger wall and more exhausted people. On paper, the desert should have made this entire project impossible. There was a clue sitting in plain sight the whole time, painted on a tomb wall. The painting shows a colossal statue strapped to a wooden sledge, with long rows of men hauling it forward. And standing at the very front of that sledge, doing what looks like a completely pointless job, is one man pouring water onto the sand ahead of the runners. For years, people looked at that figure and assumed it was ceremonial, a ritual gesture, something symbolic that didn't actually do anything. It was doing more than anyone else in the picture. When physicists eventually tested it properly, they found that wet sand behaves nothing like dry sand. Water makes the grains cling to one another. So instead of heaping up into a wall, the surface stays firm and flat under the runners. Get the moisture just right, and the force needed to drag that sledge drops by around half. That isn't a minor improvement. That's the difference between 130 men and 260. One man with a water jar was quietly doing the work of 100 men on the rope. Once you've seen that, you start wondering what else on those walls got dismissed as decoration. Because there's another trick buried in this story, and it's the reason these cities ended up exactly where they did. If you're enjoying pulling these forgotten methods back out of the dirt, hit subscribe right now, because the next one completely rewrites what the word heavy even means. Here's the trick. If you're clever, you don't drag the stone at all. You float it. Water carries weight for free. A wooden barge on a moving river will shift a load that would cripple 100 men on land, and it'll do it while everyone on board sits down. So the smartest decision ancient builders ever made wasn't inventing a tool, it was choosing where to build. Look at where the great stone cities went up, and you'll notice how tightly they cluster along rivers and coastlines. That isn't about the view. Quarry upstream, site downstream, current doing the hauling in between. They pushed it further than that. They cut canals inland from the river, so the floodwater came to the construction site, which meant barges could unload almost at the foot of the build. During the flood, the stone practically arrived at the door. So a block that would take 200 people a full, brutal day to drag over open ground could cover miles overnight on moving water, with a handful of men steering. Which means the distance was never the hard part. The hard part was always the last few hundred meters. The moment the stone comes off the water and has to go up. And up is where people die. Nobody has ever found a crane in the ancient world, because there wasn't one. What they had instead was a small set of ideas so simple they almost feel like cheating. The first is the ramp. Pile up rubble, mud brick, and sand into a long, shallow slope. And suddenly, you aren't lifting the stone at all. You're dragging it. And dragging is a thing you already know how to do. A gentle enough slope turns a lift into a haul, and a haul is survivable. The second is the lever, a stout wooden beam under the lip of a block, a stone to pivot on, and one person can raise a corner that 10 people couldn't lift straight up, slide a wedge in, cross to the other side, do it again. It's agonizingly slow. and it works every single time. The third is the rocker, and this one feels closest to magic. Blocks get tipped onto curved wooden cradles, and a crew rocks them side to side while packing timber underneath, lifting the load a finger's width with every swing. Give them a day, and a stone the size of a car walks itself up onto a platform. None of this needed metal. None of it needed a new invention. It needed rope, timber, and a group of people who could be relied on to move at the exact same instant. That last part isn't a tool, it's a behavior. And it's the thing that turns 200 separate humans into one machine. So how do you get 200 people, most of whom can't read, to act as a single body? There's a problem sitting underneath all of this that we've quietly walked past. Before you can move a block, somebody has to cut it out of a mountain, and the metal available to do that was copper. Copper is soft. You can dent it with a hard thumbnail. Run a copper chisel into granite, and the chisel loses, every time, within seconds. So the obvious question is how anyone carved hard stone at all, let alone smoothed it into surfaces you can still run your hand across without catching a ridge. They stopped trying to cut it and started beating it instead. Quarry workers used balls of dolerite, a stone harder than granite, held in both hands and hammered down over and over until the surface crumbled away in dust. It's a horrible job. It's loud, it's slow, and it wrecks your wrists and your hearing. But it works. And unfinished blocks still sitting in the quarries show exactly that pattern of pounding around their edges, abandoned mid-job. For finer work, they used sand. Ordinary quartz sand is harder than most stone, so drag a copper saw through it with water, and the sand does the cutting while the soft blade just carries it along. Same idea with drilling. The tool is only a delivery system for the grit. So the secret wasn't a lost alloy or some vanished super tool. It was patience and knowing which rock beats which. But knowing all that still leaves the awkward question. And here's the question that should be bothering you by now. Where are the wheels? Humans had the wheel. It shows up on carts and chariots across the ancient world. So why is every image of a stone being moved showing a sledge instead, dragged flat along the ground like something out of the Stone Age? Because a wheel is a terrible idea under that much weight. A wheel concentrates the entire load onto two thin strips where it touches the earth. On a paved road, that's brilliant. On sand, wet clay, or soft field, a wheel carrying 15 tons doesn't roll. It sinks, cuts a trench, and stops. And now you're trying to lift a buried block out of a hole you just dug with it. Wooden axles under that load snap, and a snapped axle at speed sends a stone sideways into a crowd. A sledge does the opposite. It spreads the weight across two long, flat runners, so it rides on top of the ground instead of cutting into it. Wet the surface ahead of it, and it slides. So they weren't primitive for choosing the sledge. They'd worked out something an engineer would tell you today. The wheel only wins once you've built the road, and nobody had built the road yet. Which leaves one problem that no amount of cleverness solves: time. Before we get to that, look down at what's actually in your hands. Rope is the most underrated technology in this entire story. Every ramp, every lever, every sledge, and every barge is useless without it. And rope doesn't grow on trees. Somebody has to make it, by hand, out of plant fiber, twisted strand by strand, thousands of meters of it, and then repair it constantly because rope under load frays from the inside where you can't see. The Egyptians made theirs from papyrus and grass and palm fiber, and they made it beautifully. Coils of ancient rope have been pulled out of desert caves near the Red Sea, still holding together after more than 4,000 years, thick as your wrist, and still strong enough to be dangerous. Now imagine what a rope failure looks like on your line. 200 people are leaning back against 15 tons of stone. The fibers let go somewhere near the front. The entire line goes down backwards at once, and the block starts moving the wrong way. Downhill, into people who are lying on the ground. That's why there were rope makers on site, not as an afterthought, as a core trade, inspecting, splicing, replacing, someone whose whole job was making sure your rope outlived your shift. So the material was solved, the route was solved, the lift was solved. None of it means anything if the crowd pulling doesn't move as one. And a crowd, left alone, never does. You give them a name. This is the discovery that changed how people think about ancient building sites. And it came from graffiti. Deep inside the structures, in cavities that were sealed up and never meant to be seen again, workers had painted marks on the stone in red ochre. Rough, casual, fast. The kind of thing you scrawl when you're sure nobody is watching. They were team names. The crews had identities. They called themselves things like the Friends of the King and the Drunkards of Mencore, and they signed the blocks they placed. Big gangs were split into smaller units, each with its own tag, its own foreman, its own record of what it had done. Read that back and it stops sounding ancient at all. That's a company with departments. That's a football club with a badge. That's a group of men who want their name on the underside of a stone. And the second teams have names, something else shows up on its own. Competition, pride, the flat refusal to be the crew that fell behind the one from the next town over. You weren't pulling because somebody was standing over you with a weapon. You were pulling because the other gang was watching, and because your name was already painted on a block that was going to sit in the dark for the next 5,000 years. That's the real machine. Not the ramp, not the lever. Identity. But pride holds a crowd together for a season. Feeding, housing, and scheduling thousands of people year after year needs something colder than pride. It needs counting. And counting is where this story takes a turn nobody expects. Somebody had to know how much grain went out today, how many crews were on site, how many sledges were in for repair, and how many days of food were left in the store. Get that wrong by a single week, and you don't have a construction delay. You have a starving mob in a desert. So the record keeping got serious. Tally marks pressed into clay, notches cut into wood, then symbols standing in for amounts, then for goods, then for people. That isn't a side effect of these building projects. That's arguably where writing comes from. Not poetry, not prayer, not history, inventory. The oldest tablets we have are gloriously boring. They're receipts, barley in, beer out, workers paid, sheep counted, this crew short 2 men. Somebody's spreadsheet, baked into clay, outliving the kingdom that produced it. Which means the genuine invention behind these cities was never a lifting device. It was logistics. The ability to move food, water, timber, and human beings around a landscape on a schedule and have them all arrive on the right day. Stone was never the hard part. People were the hard part. But all of this rests on an assumption we haven't questioned yet. It assumes you need a city, a king, and a bureaucracy before anybody can build something enormous. There's a hill in southern Turkey that says that's completely backwards. Göbekli Tepe is roughly 11,500 years old. That number doesn't land properly until you set it beside everything else. It's older than farming being widespread, older than pottery, older than metal, older than the wheel, older than writing by thousands of years, and older than the pyramids by more than twice the gap between the pyramids and you sitting there now. And it isn't a hut. It's rings of carved stone pillars, some standing 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, cut out of bedrock, hauled uphill, and decorated with animals, foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, built by people who did not have farms. The old story went like this. Humans settled down, invented agriculture, produced surplus food, built towns, and eventually got rich enough to raise monuments. Göbekli Tepe puts the monument first, at the front of the line, before any of it, which suggests something genuinely unsettling. Maybe we didn't build cities and then start building big. Maybe dragging thousands of people into one place to build something huge is what forced us to work out how to feed them all, and farming was the solution to a problem the building had already created. The monument may have built the city instead of the other way around. And then there's the last detail about that site. At some point, they buried it on purpose, filled the whole thing in with rubble and earth, which is the only reason it survived for us to find. Nobody knows why. If you think that's an isolated case, look at what people did with stone in places with no rivers, no kings, and no bureaucracy at all. On Salisbury Plain, the huge sarsen stones of Stonehenge were brought from hills around 15 miles away, each one weighing over 20 tons. 15 miles doesn't sound far, until you picture doing it at the speed of a walking crowd over uneven chalk downland, with the whole community stopping their normal lives to do it. Some of the smaller stones there came from Wales, roughly 150 miles off. Then there's Easter Island, where nearly 1,000 giant statues were moved out of a quarry and stood up along the coast, on an island with barely any big timber left. Everyone assumed the islanders must have dragged them lying down on wooden rollers, which conveniently explains why the island lost its forest. The islanders themselves always said something else. Their oral tradition insisted the statues walked. That was treated as a myth for a very long time. Then, researchers noticed something about the shape of the unfinished statues still in transit. They lean forward. The base is curved. So a team tried it. They put ropes on a full-size replica and had 3 small groups rocket side to side while pulling, and the statue swung forward on its own curved base, step by step, upright. It walked, exactly like you'd waddle a fridge across a kitchen floor. Except this fridge is 4 meters tall and made of rock, which means the islanders had been telling the truth for centuries, and nobody bothered to listen. Now, here's the thing nobody puts on a documentary poster. Most ancient cities weren't made of that kind of stone at all. They were made of mud. Mud brick built more of the ancient world than granite ever did. You dig clay, mix it with straw and water, press it into wooden molds, and leave it in the sun. Nothing gets quarried, nothing gets floated. A family can make several hundred bricks in a day using material that's lying under their feet, for free. That's how Uruk went up. And Uruk may have been the first place on Earth where tens of thousands of humans lived pressed together inside one wall. That's how vast stretches of Mesopotamia were built, and huge parts of the Indus Valley too. Go earlier, and it gets stranger. At Çatalhöyük in Turkey, 9,000 years ago, people packed mud brick houses so tightly against each other that there were no streets at all. You didn't walk between the buildings because there was no between. You walked over the roofs, and you climbed down into your own home through a hole in the ceiling by ladder. Think about living like that. Your neighbor's ceiling is your pavement. You hear everything. You're never once alone. And they buried their dead underneath the floors of the rooms they slept in, so you spent every night lying directly above your own grandmother. Mud brick has one obvious weakness, though: rain. Left alone, these buildings slump back into the ground within a generation. So how is anything still standing? Because they never really stopped building. A mud brick house needed constant patching. When one finally failed, you didn't clear the site. You knocked the walls in flat, spread the rubble, and built the new house directly on top. Do that for a few centuries, and the whole town slowly rises on a mound of its own former homes. That's what those strange, flat-topped hills across the Middle East actually are. Not natural hills, stacked cities, layer on layer on layer of people rebuilding on their grandparents' roofs, until the settlement is sitting 20 meters above the plane it started on. The city is literally built out of the collapsed remains of itself. And where they wanted something to last, they got clever with the same cheap material. Bake the outer bricks in a kiln instead of the sun, and they'll shrug off water. Face the vulnerable walls with baked brick and stone. Run drains so the rain doesn't sit against the base. Which brings up the last impossible-sounding part of this. How do you make any of it straight? You have no laser level, no tape measure, no steel square. Yet the base of the Great Pyramid is level across more than 200 meters to within a couple of centimeters, and its sides line up with north, south, east, and west almost perfectly. The leveling trick is beautiful because it uses something you already have plenty of. Water always finds its own level. Cut shallow channels across your site, flood them, and mark where the surface sits against the rock. That line is dead flat over any distance, no matter what the ground underneath is doing. Cut the site down to your marks, and the foundation is true. For direction, they used the sky. Watch a star rise on the horizon, watch where it sets, split the difference between the two, and you have true north from nothing but a pair of sticks and a lot of patience. For right angles, they used a knotted rope. Space the knots at 3, 4, and 5 units. Pull the rope tight into a triangle, and the corner is exactly square. Every time, forever, with no instrument at all. A school child's geometry lesson being used to lay out a building that would still be standing 5,000 years later. Over in the Indus Valley, they took the same obsession somewhere else. Their bricks were made to a fixed ratio, roughly 1 to 2 to 4, and those same proportions turn up in cities hundreds of kilometers apart. Standardized materials, straight streets, and covered drains running under the roads with inspection points, thousands of years before most of Europe managed either. So the transport is explained, the lifting is explained, the organization and the precision are explained. What's left is the part nobody wants to look at directly. What all of this did to the body that did it. You will not see this finished. That's the part that's easy to skip past. The biggest of these projects ran for decades. A young man who joined the first season on the Great Pyramid would be an old man, if he was lucky, by the time the last block went on. Plenty of the people who cut the foundation trench were already buried nearby before the thing was halfway up. Stonehenge is worse, if worse is the right word. That site was worked and reworked over something like 1,500 years. Not one project, a relay. Great-grandchildren finishing an idea their great-grandparents started, changing the plan as they went. Try to hold that in your head. You give your working life, your back, your knees, and probably a few of your years to something you will never once see complete. You do it knowing that, and you do it anyway, because the thing you're really building isn't the monument. It's the crew, the village, the reason the grain keeps coming and everybody survives the season. Which finally puts a number on what all this cost, not in stone, in bodies. The skeletons from the workers' cemeteries tell the truth the tomb paintings leave out. Their spines show compression. Vertebrae in men in their 20s and 30s look worn down in ways you'd expect from someone decades older, from years of carrying loads that press the joints into each other. Arthritis turns up early, especially through the lower back and the knees. The arms and hands show it too. Torn muscle attachments that healed into thickened, ridged bone, joint surfaces polished flat from doing the same movement several 100,000 times. And it wasn't only the men on the ropes. Women's skeletons from the same period carry their own damage, from hours every day kneeling over a grindstone to turn grain into flour, wearing down the toes, the knees, and the base of the spine. Feeding a build site was its own kind of labor, and it never stopped, not for one day. A lot of these people were dead before 40. So the fear you started with was right. This work did use your body up. There was a real physical price for every one of those blocks, and it got paid in joints and vertebrae and years taken off the end of a life. But the same bones carry something else, and it changes the entire meaning of the story. The fractures healed. Broken arms, broken legs, crushed feet. Set properly, splinted and knitted back together straight enough that the person walked again afterward. Some skeletons even show amputations where the bone has grown smooth and closed over the cut, which means that person survived the injury and then went on living for years. Think about what that actually requires. Somebody had to drag you out from under the stone. Somebody had to carry you back to the village. Somebody had to know how to set the bone and how to hold it there. And then somebody had to feed you, house you, and sit with you for months while you produced absolutely nothing for anyone. In a world with no real medicine, on a site where you were technically replaceable by the next man in line, they kept you. That's the answer to the question you've been chasing this whole time. There was no lost machine, no secret device, no forgotten technology waiting under the sand for someone to rediscover it. The machine was the crowd. It was rope, water, timber, gravity, and a few thousand people who trusted each other enough to pull at the same instant, eat from the same store, and haul an injured man out of the mud instead of stepping over him. Everything since then, every crane, every engine, every tower of glass and steel, is just a faster version of that same arrangement. Strip the machinery off any construction site standing today, and you're left with exactly what stood at Giza. A group of humans who agreed to move together. The stones were never the achievement. We were.